It's time to move on to the Scrum events. The first event we're going to talk about is the sprint. So the sprint is a fixed length event of 1 month or less that creates consistency as our Scrum team works on solving these complex adaptive problems.
I like it. And a big point of note here, Ryan, is straight out of the gate. Let's put this down here. A sprint, as described by the Scrum Guide, is 1 month or less. Right? It's 1 month or less. Usually shorter, right? The determination of the sprint length, I think, is a pretty big topic that we probably won't get into here too much. Just know it's a whole Scrum team consideration. But you determine sprint length really by thinking about how far the product owner can get away from stakeholders and how much risk they're willing to have with that. So the rule of Scrum, though, is that 1 month or less. 1 month or less.
Yeah, and the sprint length is really a planning horizon for this container event, right? All of the activities within Scrum happen within the sprint. There's no outside activities. So this is kind of, we call it the Tupperware event. It's everything goes inside this constraint. So all of the work needed to get a done, usable, valuable increment, like we talked about in previous videos, happens within the time box of 1 month or less.
And important point here to make is 1 month or less container event, and a new sprint starts immediately after the conclusion of the current sprint, which means the second you end that sprint, the second that retrospective happens, the second you hop into sprint planning, a new sprint begins right after that. We don't have a buffer for testing, we don't have a buffer for anything else. All the work that needs to happen to get to done, as per your definition of done, and produce a usable increment happens within the walls of the sprint, and a new sprint starts immediately after the conclusion of the current sprint.
Exactly. And the result of each and every one of those sprints should be a usable product increment, right? That is the purpose of the sprint, is to create these usable product increments. Because again, the point of Scrum is done.
Yeah. And, we mentioned this when we talked about the sprint backlog, the artifact sprint backlog. Scope may change. Scope may change, the little nuance of scope. However, nothing changes that threatens the sprint goal, because we're driven by the sprint goal here. So scope may change, the sprint goal shouldn't. The sprint goal is a fixed commitment really at the beginning of a sprint. Although, if information emerges that needs us to change that or abort the sprint, that's okay. It may happen, but ultimately scope may change, but the sprint goal shouldn't. It's driven by the sprint goal.
And while we're considering those changes, we cannot decrease the quality of our product or of the increment. So during a sprint, we cannot do anything that would decrease quality, which means testing, integration, all of those things that we talked about in the definition of done section are mandatory as per the rules of the sprint.
Yeah. And, tying all this room together, tying the room together, as they say, these cards, no changes can be made that endanger the sprint goal. That means no changes that decrease quality, no scope changes, no additive things that should happen that endanger the sprint goal, right? I think that's a good final point that really ties this whole row together.
I'm going to put one more point up there, Todd. I hope you don't mind.
Do it. Yeah,
I want to make sure we're super clear. There are no special sprints. Sprint 0 does not exist. There's no hardening sprints, no testing sprints, no special sprints. As we said at the beginning, it is the container event. All the work that needs to happen to get to a done, usable, valuable increment happens within the sprint.
Yeah. I like that, right? No special sprints. Let's get that out of there. That's an anti-pattern, It's an anti-pattern. I think one thing that I'd like to call out here as we get to the tail end of this one is, we have mentioned 1 month or less, right? Just because other people use 2-week sprints doesn't mean you need to. Ryan and I work with teams that are doing 1 month sprints, 1 day sprints, 1 week sprints, 2 week sprints, 3 week sprints. It's really based on the context of the situation that you're working in. And it could be team to team. It doesn't have to be organizational wide, right? So just really thought that I would call that out. I feel like that kind of fits in nicely with the no special sprints thing, right? There is no panacea to tell you exactly what you should be doing as far as sprint length. So, don't believe anybody that tells you otherwise.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because it's the heartbeat of your work, right? The sprint is the heartbeat. And so once you pick a sprint length, which is really just a planning horizon, how long can you go without feedback? How long can your developers focus? How long can the organization stand to go without putting something in the market? All of these are great considerations. So as Todd said, there's no right de facto answer. It's very contextually specific, but it does establish a heartbeat. So once you decide on the right sprint length, stick with that for a while, right? Let things become, keep a consistent heartbeat going. And that will help us in our discussions on metrics and all sorts of other topics.
I've got a great question for the people out there watching this. Right?
If
you're using Scrum right now, what's your sprint length? And to build on top, what's your sprint length and why is that your sprint length? If you're not using Scrum yet, if you're looking at this, and which is okay, and we love that you're here, what do you think sprint length would make sense for the context of the situation that you're working in? Right? I think that's a really good discussion, knowing that this is a container event. We'd love to hear your comments, see what you're thinking, see why you're arriving at those conclusions. And I think that's good for the sprint. We're going to move on in our next video to sprint planning. We'll see you over there.